And for the remainder of the material we're covering on reptiles, we're going to be going over locomotion. And some of the key things you should be able to do, explain the movements that are involved in the locomotion of lizards, as well as comparing and contrasting the morphology of arboreal lizards and lizards that are arguably steady terrestrial forms, and across major groups keep track of how these critters swim. There are a variety of ways that this happens. Okay? Excuse me. Mask is making me itchy today. Well, let's start with a little question. Namely, if the locomotion of most extant limbed reptiles is similar to that of limbed salamanders, what are some key things you would expect to see? Please write down your thoughts and then we'll go over. They all should have a very good handle on how salamanders move. And also keep in mind that we sort of used salamanders as a model for the ancestral tetrapodal condition. Okay, let's see what you came up with. Let's start in the back two rows on the left side of the room. You can give me one thing.
Oh, wait, is that?
Yeah, you.
Sorry, you said left, and this is right. The radius and ulnar are separated.
Okay, that's an anatomical trait. Mm-hmm. But as far as movements go, with respect to locomotion, so what can you say regarding locomotion in particular?
The femur rotation and femur retraction, that kind of stuff.
One thing will suffice. I'm delighted you're coming up with more. So what was that again?
Femur rotation.
Okay. So that is a propulsive movement? Is that correct? And in what way does the femur rotate? What direction are you referring to?
It's like I think we did in class, it's like we're going. I don't know
Okay.
how to describe that.
Well, you're doing this. Anyone else?
Anterior posterior?
Is there any anterior posterior movement of the femur, assuming my humerus represents the femur?
Alternating forward rotation.
Not quite. Do you have an idea? What kind of rotation is that? It's not this, right?
Right.
Okay. Long axis? Long axis femur rotation? It's an overcast Friday. I think everyone wants to take a nap, right? Okay. Next row up on the left side of the room. Can you add to our list?
Diagonal couplets.
Okay, so as far as foot placement goes. And one row behind you guys, in between. Can you pop with something?
Femur retraction.
Mm-hmm. Everybody put your arms up, assume the salamander position, and retract. We're getting variable movements. Okay, so that is a rotational movement, but it is in the horizontal plane, and the distal part of the femur moves posteriorly. So remember, for retraction movements, that refers to things moving posteriorly, and protraction, things moving anteriorly. And in the case of appendages, we're referring to the distal part of the appendage. Okay, so the propulsive movement is the distal part of the femur, or for that matter, it could be the humerus for the forelimb, is retracted. Okay, let's see, fourth row from the back. Left side of the room. Can you add to our list?
Girdle rotation?
Okay. And the direction of that movement is,
Horizontal.
well, it's within the horizontal plane, right? Okay, very good. And what causes that?
Bending of the vertebrae?
Okay. So next row up, does that give you some ideas? What causes girdle rotation?
So lateral bending.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the girdle is attached to the vertebral column. The vertebral column bends, and a key thing to remember is bending from side to side, lateral bending. Okay? It's a pretty good list, pretty good starting point, right? Well, in fact, all those things do hold for the locomotion of limbed squamates. So one of the reasons we spent a good bit of time on salamanders is that once you have that firmly in hand, you actually understand a lot of things about how something like a lizard moves, except under some unusual circumstances. So we've got a whole bunch of similarities that we just dashed through. There are those three key movements that are very important as a result of both lizards and salamanders having sprawling limb postures. So remember, on sprawling limb posture, we're talking about the feet being lateral to where the limb attaches to the body, right? Sprawling does not refer to straight or bent limbs. It refers to where that foot is relative to the point of limb attachment. Okay? There are differences. Some of those differences are really quantitative differences. I think one noteworthy difference is a lot of lizards are pretty doggone fast compared to salamanders of a similar size. Now, there's a little bit of a confounding factor there, is that most salamanders in the field have active body temperatures much, much, much lower than lizards, okay? And remember, for a lot of physiological rate processes, a common rule of thumb is that a rate process will actually double over a 10-degree centigrade change. That's referred to as a Q10 value. If you look at the change in something over a 10-degree change. And in fact, salamanders are commonly active with body temperatures of 20 degrees centigrade. Some of the lizards I've studied in the Mojave Desert actually had body temperatures of 42 to 43 degrees centigrade. What's human body temperature?
98.6.
And centigrade? Are we that American that we can only think Fahrenheit?
Yes.
37. Okay. So again, one of my pet peeves about terminology is how often do you hear people referring to warm-blooded and versus cold-blooded? Please don't do that. Make the distinction between ectotherms and endotherms, because there are actually some ectotherms that have higher body temperatures than some endotherms. Endo and ecto refer to the source of the heat energy. That tells me nothing about what the body temperature actually is, okay? So a lot of lizards are speedy. If you've ever tried to catch one, maybe you have some practical experience with that. This is one of my favorite little video clips of one of the fastest lizards that I'm aware of. This grid is, let's see, I think that's about 10 centimeters, or is that 20 centimeters? The snout vent length of this lizard is about 10 centimeters. And just so you can get your bearings, this is a side view, and on this clock, this digital clock, these last digits are 1,000th of a second. And then here's an overhead view. And there's some paint on the lizard to mark the location of the pelvic girdle. So notice that indeed you have bending of the vertebral column, which causes girdle rotation, but then you've got all of those limb movements that we talked about too. But there's some other interesting things going on that wouldn't be so apparent to the naked eye if you look at these lizards running really, really fast. Notice that the feet of this species of lizards and many species of lizards are actually quite long. And yet, if you look at the tracks left by these lizards running on sand, it's a perfect circular little crater. And the reason for that is when these lizards run really fast, rather than remaining flat-footed, they actually extend the ankle. So they're running up on their toes. Now, a long time, the big feet of lizards were thought of as something that aided with remaining stable for a sprawling limb posture. But a very interesting feature is when you look at some species of lizards that are fast, so notice here the foot's just touching down, and notice that the heel actually never touches. So by increasing the straightness of the different portions within the limb, these lizards actually have an exquisite ability to modulate the effective length of the limb, namely the distance from where the limb attaches to the body to where it touches on the ground. Okay? And these particular guys very readily just go back and forth between running using all four limbs and running just using the hind limbs. Okay? So those little guys were going over 5 meters a second, and keep in mind the snout vent length was only 10 centimeters, so they were going 50 body lengths per second. Okay? Some of you are approximately 2 meters tall. I don't think many of you could do 100 meters in 1 second, right? Pretty darn impressive. Fast. Okay? And bipedality is actually very common in lizards compared to salamanders. Here's another example with which you may be familiar. Boy, that's a weird looking lizard.
Oh gosh.
Oh, live action clippers.
Yeah.
You're right.
Basilisk lizards are looking for food. Basilisks have been nicknamed the Jesus Christ lizard. Why? This adult male, probably the father of the young lizards, can't tell us. Nor can this female, exclusive property of the territorial male. It has nothing to do with the feeding habits of the basilisk, which consists primarily of insects and berries.
That sounds
This predatory reptile will help reveal the secret as it stalks the young basilisk.
So they can run
The
on the
basilisk is called
surface
the
of
Jesus
the water.
Christ lizard because it can walk, well, really run on water.
They cannot walk.
It swivels its hind legs, and the tail becomes a counterweight. We can't know what the snake is thinking.
We
Did it
cannot.
really want to
Enough said. Okay, so what's interesting is that, have any of you ever gone water skiing and hit the water? You know, you're going fast enough, even though it's a liquid, there's a substantial resistance to actually penetrating the water surface. And these lizards have spectacularly long toes. They even have some scales that extend out from the toes a little bit to make a little bit of a fringe. And they're able to slap their feet hard enough on the water to get substantial enough reactive forces to do two things: to remain on the surface of the water, but actually propel themselves forward. So pretty spectacular example. I'm not aware of any species of lizards other than basilisks that do that. Okay? Now, the other thing is, if you try to think back collectively to those little video clips, is even though at rest the vast majority of lizards have a sprawling limb posture, it's good to not think of sprawling versus erect limbs as a dichotomy, that it's either one or the other. In fact, this is one of many examples where those are the two extremes along a continuum of variation. And another thing that these more recent studies using high-speed video have found is that actually the posture of many of these lizards that run rapidly changes with speed. Namely, with increased speed, you see more adduction of the femur. But a bunch of those details do depend on the particular species of lizard, okay? Another thing that is different between lizards and salamanders is lizards have claws. So, of course, claws can engage in surfaces and help prevent slipping. And you're probably aware that many species of lizards very readily climb a wide variety of surfaces, okay? Now, again, if we paint with broad brushstrokes, how can we characterize for sort of a generic lizard? What's a good analogy? I think a good analogy is most lizards are little dragsters, okay? They're not Formula One cars, okay, but they're little dragsters. Namely, lizards have a remarkable ability to get up to their top speed very, very rapidly. Now, some of them do attain impressive speeds for their size, but what's even more impressive than that, many species of lizards can, in 2 or 3 strides, get up to about 90 to 95% of their top speed. If some of you are fans of track and field, you may realize that in sprinting events for elite humans, generally a human sprinter is still accelerating for about the first 40 to 60 meters within a 100-meter dash. So for an elite human, it very well may take the better part of 20 strides to hit top speed. That's a heck of a difference. Now, there's a bit of a caveat there because humans are rather big, okay? So it's important to realize that some of the ability to accelerate rapidly is also attributable to a small size and the way muscle size scales with body weight, okay? What fiber type is good for these short, explosive movements?
Fast muscle fibers?
Yes, the fast glycolytic fibers. So if you think back to the locomotion of fishes and that very rapid and powerful escape response, that's being driven almost entirely by fast glycolytic fibers. They're very good for generating large amounts of force very fast, but they lose that ability to generate force very rapidly. So often after on the order of maybe about 40 contractions or so, these fibers poop out. So there are actually some trade-offs between having muscle physiology well suited for sprinting as opposed to a muscle physiology that's well suited for sustaining high speeds for prolonged periods of time. So again, think of lizards pretty much as little dragsters. And just as is the case with dragsters, lizards lack that ability to sustain high speeds for prolonged periods of time. Now, a lot of times you can make some reasonable inferences from morphology about consequences for function. And you should realize that you need more information than just the anatomy, but in fact the anatomy often does give some hints about what's good for different types of movement. And in a lot of lizards, that perform a lot of bipedal locomotion, you'll often see that their hind limbs are quite long. If you look at the total length of the hind limb all the way from the hip to the tip of the toe, that's relatively long compared to the distance of the body of the animal between the girdles. A lot of that length is actually from the distal portion of the limb, rather than all parts of these limbs sort of enlarging equally. Okay? And as you can see in this illustration of a collared lizard native to the western United States, the forelimbs are often substantially shorter than the hind limb in species that perform a lot of bipedal locomotion. And compared to that limb length, the distance between the girdles, the trunk, is relatively short. Very often, you see quite long tails in lizards that are adept at performing bipedal locomotion. One of the consequences of having a sizable and lengthy tail is that if you have more mass behind the hind limbs, that shifts the center of mass rather than necessarily being in between the girdles. It shifts the center of mass posteriorly, and the mechanics of running bipedally are enhanced by getting that center of mass closer to the hind limbs that are actually doing the propelling. Okay? Over the years, there's probably been a little bit of an oversell, however, on the importance of a long tail for running bipedal. One of the striking features of those zebra tail lizards that I showed you running on the treadmill is you're probably well aware that many lizards can autotomize their tail as a defensive behavior. It breaks off very readily and then grows back. And in that particular species, lizards with stubbed tails after autotomy still run very quickly and bipedally. So if you look in some of the older literature, you'll sort of see a big deal being made out of big long tail sort of serving as a counterweight, which helps rock the front end of the lizard up. But more recent work indicates the primary reason why the lizards appear to pop up the front end of the trunk, once again, is analogous to what happens in a dragster. If you think of the hind limbs as axles of a wheel, and if you have a force like this, that's going to tend to elevate the front part of the dragster or the front part of the lizard, whichever the case may be. So a lot of the bipedal locomotion that lizards do may simply be an artifact of having these very rapid accelerations and a large amount of torque because of that long axis femur rotation that so characterizes sprawling limb vertebrates. Okay? Here are just a couple of other pictures of bipedal lizards. That's the one that was on the treadmill, the zebra tail lizard. Notice its tail is not nearly as long as this collared lizard. And if you want to see some funny videos, go online and do a search for frilled lizards of Australia. And besides being very adept at running bipedally, they have this crazy frill that they use with territorial displays and as a defensive behavior. And commonly seems to get used in various horror films or whatever the case may be when they're trying to get a scary looking reptile. Okay? Now, another area in which you can find some anatomical specializations are lizards that are arboreal, or found up off the ground and in trees. And what I think is one of the most remarkable examples of convergent evolution is the occurrence of toe pads in anole lizards and in geckos. You've seen these in lab and used these to help you tell different types of lizards from each other. And on these scales that go from side to side along the toes, there are all kinds of itty bitty, sort of microscopic hair-like structures. And those structures are so tiny, they are very well suited for conforming to all of the microscopic irregularities in surfaces. If you were to put this surface under a microscope, even though at a gross level it looks flat, if you go to a fine enough spatial scale, it is not flat. And as it turns out, if you get more and more intimate contact between two things, there's this crazy thing called van der Waals forces, which basically are molecular level interactions of one thing being attracted to another. And it's those van der Waals forces that allow lizards to stick to things. So those toe pads are not sticky like tape, but rather they have structures that conform beautifully to the surface features and allow the lizards to adhere with a dry adhesion mechanism. Actually, it's technically not adhesive forces, but rather those van der Waals forces. Now, another strategy for preventing slipping on various branches is to hang on. This is actually quite unusual within lizards, although I'm sure all of you are aware this is reasonably common within mammals. And a wonderful example of this are the old world chameleons. Not only do they have prehensile feet, those prehensile feet are highly specialized. So on both the fore and the hind limbs, you have basically these two little bundles of toes that are outstanding for gripping. On top of that, chameleons have a prehensile tail. Now, prehensile tails are quite common in arboreal snakes, but they're not especially common in lizards. There are some other groups of lizards that have prehensile tails, but the prehensile tail of chameleons is especially noteworthy for how adept it is at grabbing onto very, very small diameter twigs and branches. Okay? An interesting side note for chameleons, you'll recall chameleons have the spectacular ability to project their tongue over long distances and at very high speed. Now, if you think back to those other little lizards that were catching flies up in the air, they were moving their entire body rapidly in order to capture prey. Chameleons move painfully slowly, very stealthily, and they actually have a huge proportion of slow oxidative fibers, so a lot of them couldn't even move fast if they wanted to use fast. But that specialized tongue makes up for that inability for the entire lizard to move fast, because that tongue moves darn fast, okay, and is very effective, as we saw previously. Okay? Sort of some more odds and ends about reptilian locomotion is that, remember, a generalized way of moving the limbs within a girdle is to move them alternately. And then, of course, among girdles, you would have this coordination of diagonally opposite feet. As you can see in this picture, both of the hind limbs of the crocodile are advanced forward at the same time. We'll get more into gaits when we talk about mammals, but what is extremely unusual for extant reptiles is there are a few species of crocodilians that actually gallop, where galloping involves a bilateral retraction of the limbs rather than moving the limbs alternately. So that would be a significant departure from what an ancestral reptile would be doing. Turtles, once again, are sort of in outer space as far as their locomotion goes. You're well aware that turtles indeed are slow. There are a variety of factors that contribute to that, in addition to their specialized anatomy and the shell being somewhat problematic for interfering with the ability to move the limbs. Turtles are another example of a reptilian group with a very high proportion of slow oxidative fibers. So it's not just the gross anatomy of turtles that makes them slow. The physiological properties of the muscle also make them slow. And of course, with that rigid shell, there's no ability to bend the vertebral column in between the two girdles. Okay, a variety of reptiles swim just fine. You're probably familiar with a lot of these examples. And swimming is readily accomplished by laterally undulating the axial structures. So rather than using the appendages, the vertebral column is used to propel the critter.
That face that is usually covered by her thumb has finally made an appearance. That face wouldn't be doing that.
And here you can see the undulations and primarily of the tail in crocodilians, okay? And crocodilians have a bit of webbing between the toes and everything, but for all but the very, very slowest locomotion, you can see that the limbs are pressed to the side and not moving. Instead, it's the undulations that propel the crocodilian. Lizards, much the same thing. It's not like a whole lot of lizards are aquatic, but you may be aware that in the Galapagos Islands, one species of iguana actually is marine, the marine iguana. So here we've got a marine iguana foraging actually on some of the algae that's growing on these boulders in the ocean. Another thing that's interesting, even though the Galapagos Islands are in the tropics, there's an upwelling of cold currents. So these guys have to shuttle back and forth. But there you can nicely see how the limbs are folded back. The vertebral column is undulated, but in fact, the vast majority of propulsion, again, is occurring as a result of undulations of the tail rather than undulating the entire length of the critter. Okay? And you're well aware many turtles are aquatic. And you see, again, it just boils down to what the limbs can do for turtles. And there are quite a few turtles, when in water, that will swim using diagonal couplets and all of the limbs. So if you look at this painted turtle swimming, not going to set any speed records probably, but it's going to get around just fine. And if you look very carefully, you'll notice that within a girdle, the limbs are being moved alternately, and among girdles, we see the occurrence of diagonal couplets. So although the context is different, namely the turtle's swimming rather than on land, presumably that is using a very ancient motor pattern for moving the limbs in that way. Now, I believe you're also all aware that there are some turtles that are highly aquatic, the sea turtles. Their limbs are highly modified and take the form of flippers. So how is that turtle swimming? Alternating or bilateral movements? Bilateral. And furthermore, what are those movements accomplishing? How are those movements interacting with the fluid? Do you think that's mainly a drag-based form of locomotion, that they are basically pushing like a paddle, or a lift-based? Remember when we talked about fins of fishes? So even though clearly you've got some different structures here in turtles and fishes, there are a bunch of similar mechanical things going on. What are two ways that fishes use the pectoral fins to swim? Let's see arms representing pectoral fins. But in preparation for stick your arms out. Get some surface area, for heaven's sakes, okay? And now that everyone's fins are perpendicular to the long axis of your body, I want to see a drag-based mechanism of swimming. Wow. We got, this is kind of fun to watch. Let's just do this for the rest of the day. What I was after is, if the critter wants to swim that way, a drag-based mechanism is going to push in the opposite direction of the overall direction in which the animal moves. Okay, just as when you row a boat, that's what you're doing with the oars. Okay, now stick those fins out again and imitate how a wrasse swims, or a parrotfish. We have some very slow wrasses and parrotfishes in the room. Okay. To a coarse approximation, the fins are moved up and down, and the angle of the fin changes on the downstroke and the upstroke. So you can get propulsion on down and upstroke, where with a drag-based mechanism, you only get propulsion during retraction rather than protraction. So too, you can see there's a high reliance on lift-based propulsion in sea turtles, which is radically different than those generalized appendages that were basically just pushing against the water for drag-based propulsion. Okay? And, turtles are cute. What can you say? This is a little baby. Okay? Now, let's shift gears a little bit to some additional things that are arguably derived from an ancestral tetrapod and even from an ancestral amniote. Okay? And there are a bunch of limbless squamate reptiles. And of course, that includes snakes. So it's interesting to ponder. Here we have a group of animals that secondarily lost limbs. So snakes are not limbless because they evolved from an ancestor that never had limbs. Snakes evolved from limbless ancestors. So it's very interesting to consider what has still been retained, what sort of infrastructure and behaviors have simply been retained, and what is new. Okay? And we're not going to get to it today, but next time we're going to go over different types of snake locomotion, and at the level of detail we do so, you should be able to compare and contrast the movements, patterns of muscle activity, energy required, and the speeds for which these different types of movements of snake are used. Okay? Get out a piece of paper, and in 1 minute, put your name, date, 7 items with yes or no. Yes is a picture of a particular number, is a snake, and no if it is not. And you will be handing this in to make sure you've got your name printed just as you want. So yes or no for numbers 1 through 7. Yes, it's a snake. No, it's not. Because everyone knows what a snake is. Now we've had all the reptile heads, right? Okay, and in your papers. Okay, there are 3 critters in picture number 1. Who says it's a snake? Raise your hands. Who says it's not a snake? Raise your hands. It's not a snake. What is it?
It looks like a worm.
Everything on here is a vertebrate. Let's take another vote. You can't really tell from the outside. And this magnification, is it a snake? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. What is it?
Is it like a limbless lizard?
And what type of limbless lizard?
I can't remember.
Ophisaurus.
It's in the same family. It's an anguid lizard. Okay? And they have movable eyelids and external ear openings. Snakes have neither. How many of you saw the Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark? So people were still watching that on DVDs and so on. You realize the intrepid hero had a bit of a fear of snakes, was being lowered into the pit. They had a technical glitch trying to film that scene, getting enough animals. And I saw it in the theater. That dates me, right? And when I saw that, I couldn't help but blurting out, about half those things are lizards. So they were actually, look at that again, about half of the things crawling around are anguid lizards, and you can actually see the external ear openings. Another thing anguid lizards have is a fold along the length of the body that's very conspicuous, and anguid lizards do not have as many vertebrae as snakes. So when you get used to how snakes move, anguid lizards don't have a body that's as supple as snakes because they don't have as many vertebrae. So, no, anguid lizard. Number 2, is that a snake? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. What is it if it's not a snake? Something else? Well, number 2 is a snake. That's a blind burrowing snake. Remember, those are the scolopophidians. They no longer have functional eyes. They don't have very big heads. They're specialized for eating itty bitty things like ants and termites. Okay, so that's a snake. Number 3, is that a snake? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. If it's not a snake, what is it?
It looks like
Just,
this is.
Everything on here is a reptile. Let's revote. Is it a snake? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. There's still lots of no's, but I don't know what the heck it is. Someone tell me. It is an amphisbaenian. Okay? They're very convergent with Sicilians. They don't have eyes. A lot of them have lost pigment. They're specialized burrowers. Okay. Number 4, is that a snake? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. We got a unanimous agreement. That's wonderful for illustrating why science is not a democracy, because you're uniformly wrong. Okay? That is a pida-coated lizard from Australia. Gotcha. Number 5, is that a snake? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Does anyone say no? No no's? What's the problem? Another pida-coated lizard.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously. Okay. Number 6, is that a snake? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Oh, people get a little scared, huh? Who says no? Raise your hands. In fact, that's another windless lizard. That's a banded lizard. Okay. Number 7, is that a snake? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. Is that unanimous? That's unanimously right. Isn't that ending on a nice kind note? The point I want to make here is, it is true that snakes are long, skinny animals lacking legs that are functional for locomotion, but that is not unique to snakes. This is something that has evolved convergently many times. All these are squamate reptiles. And it's evolved convergently many times, even within certain families of squamate reptiles, such as the family of skinks. So the most unique thing about snakes, think back to how they feed, is actually the skull of snakes, not the fact that they're long and skinny and legless. True or false? Snakes lack legs. Who says true? Raise your hands. Who says false? Raise your hands. What?
I'm pretty sure there's one snake that has like really tiny legs that actually doesn't do anything. I don't remember what it's called.
Absolutely. So, the scolicophidians and henophidians actually have vestigial legs. And consequently, you can correctly refer to snakes with legs and lizards without, because some of these legless lizards do not even have vestiges of the legs anymore. So those legs in snakes are not useful for locomotion. Oddly enough, in boas and pythons, they require the secondary functions of the males stimulating the females, so they're receptive to mating. Okay? But snakes are long and skinny and have a high number of vertebrae, and they lack legs that are functional for locomotion. So next time, we're going to see how, with this derived body plan, these snakes move, and I'm hoping you'll be impressed at the many different ways that snakes are able to move in nearly any conceivable surface and habitat.